Hello Internet and welcome back to Myth Brigade. I'm Jason and I'm recovering from a case of the flu that would make Nurgle proud. But I will still be your host for this episode of Rules Bites. And today we're going to be continuing our series on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition by Cubicle 7. This time though, we're going to be focused on magic. I consider the lore behind Warhammer's magic system to be one of the richest and edgiest of any RPG I've tried. That said, we're not going to cover much of that here. Instead, we're going to focus mostly on the rules that you're going to need to bring the system to life in your campaign. But for the lore buffs out there, I have included some links to some awesome videos from people who know the details as if they've kind of lived it. They're in the description below. So when you're finished here, definitely give those a watch and be sure to tell them that Myth Brigade sent you. In the meanwhile, there's a lot to cover in these rules, so let's get started with a quick primer on magic. Magic in Warhammer Fantasy is powered by the winds of magic, or a series of otherworldly energies that flow into the old world from a dimensional tear far to the north of the Empire. These can be manipulated using lingua praestantia, or the language of magic, to create otherworldly spell effects. The language of magic is actually a derivative of Enochian, which is a more powerful language used by the elves for their spells and spoken by magical creatures across the old world. Each wind of magic relates to a particular lore or focal area for the effects that it can produce. They can be combined, but that's a risky proposition for the frail human mind, and one that can result in corruption, madness, or even outright damnation. That sounds like fun. Who doesn't like a little damnation? When teaching mankind the ways of magic, the elves insisted that practitioners limit themselves to a single lore to avoid an inevitable bad scenario and maybe the tentacles that we talked about in our episode on corruption. So humans have essentially formed schools aligning with the lores, each approaching the craft in its own unique way. The lore of fire, for example, relies on a wind called ARCANE, the red wind. Practitioners of this lore are called the Bright Order and are well known for weaving their energies into spectacular effects of searing heat and flame. They're well known for their fiery tempers as well, and their prevalence as battle magisters in the various armies of the old world. Even their healing spells involve fire. For example, cauterize rather than the bing, you're healed approach. Who doesn't want to get cut by a sword only to have to be cauterized with the fiery? Before you can learn how to manipulate the winds of magic, you must first be able to perceive them. This ability is granted by a talent called Second Sight, and that's detailed on page 144 of the core rules. Coupled with training and a little bit of practice, Second Sight allows a practitioner to sense the winds in the world around them. Now, the specifics on how this comes across to your character may vary, and it's really up to you and the GM. Maybe it's a certain smell. Maybe the character gets a sweet taste in his or her mouth, or hears a strange buzzing sound when the winds are near. Maybe the sense even varies in some ways based on the wind or its intensity. This is the place where you can take some liberties to enhance roleplay and make your character unique. Go ahead, tell a story. Another benefit of Second Sight is that the etheric senses work alongside other abilities like intuition, perception, and skills like track. So when calling for checks on these, the GM should consider if there might be some magical residue or changes in the wind in the vicinity that a sensitive character could perceive. For example, consider a scenario where the party is tracking a cunning thief who has stolen a powerful artifact. The enemy might be skilled enough to avoid leaving physical traces, but his passing with such a power in hand might leave a detectable trail for someone with a second sight. So think about this as you're weaving stories and make sure that you give your magic sensitive folks opportunities to make rolls as appropriate. Next, spells. There are 4 types of spells in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition. These are Petty spells, which are simple tricks or cantrips in other RPGs. They're less formal spells and more like tricks that a character learns as they're kind of discovering their magical gift. Their use is discouraged by the colleges of magic after a certain point, since their casting isn't really regulated and they draw from various winds. The effects of these are pretty trivial in nature, but they can be pretty useful. So, arcane spells, which are available to any practitioner of magic, or better yet, every lore can power a version of these spells. So when describing the effects of the spell, the GM should tailor to the character's arcane talent. Players should feel encouraged to weigh in as well on how arcane spells manifest for their characters. Just make notes so that it's consistent every time you cast it. Lore spells, or spells tied to a specific wind. Note that to cast spells from a lore, a character needs the arcane magic talent for that lore. So for example, arcane magic fire. Chaos spells. These consist of demonology, necromancy, and the lores of the ruinous powers. Their use is restricted to those who are kind of already on the road to damnation, or maybe they've already arrived and they're waiting at the table. If you have access to these, believe me, you'll know it. Memorizing spells works a little differently in Warhammer, and it's a little more realistic. Characters can cast any spell they have in their grimoire. However, that can be a little time-consuming and in some situations pretty risky to attempt. To combat this, characters can spend XP to memorize spells. The cost varies based on your intelligence and how many spells you've already memorized. And this can be a little tricky compared to some systems, but I love the level of realism. Once memorized, the character can permanently cast that spell without the aid of his or her grimoire. Page 133 has the details on the costs for this. Actually casting spells is driven by a couple of factors: an arcane magic talent corresponding to your character's selected lore, and the language magic skill, which you develop like any other skill. On your turn, you make a language magic test and compare the success level to the casting number of the spell you're trying to manifest. If your success level is higher than the casting succeeds, and you produce the spell effect described with the spell's description. If the success level is lower than the casting number, then your attempt fails and your action is wasted. I think this is a really cool way of representing the effort behind casting spells, and that some spells are harder than others. Note that language magic tests can be modified to reflect challenging situations, advantage, and so on. Like any other tests, language magic can produce a critical success. In game terms, a critical success means there was a surge in the magical energy you're harnessing, granting the spell extra potency, but with complications. So when rolling a critical success, you get to choose from a couple outcomes. The first is critical cast. So if the spell causes damage, it also immediately causes a critical wound. Next, total power. This means the spell is cast regardless of the casting number and the success level, but it can still be dispelled. And finally, unstoppable force. So if your success level was enough to cast the spell, it is cast successfully and it cannot be dispelled. You get to choose from any of those results on a critical. Now all that's pretty cool, but since the winds are flaring with such ferocity, characters rolling critical casting success must also roll on the minor miscast table on page 234. That makes me so happy. Most of the results here are pretty trivial, but watch out for the higher numbers because there's some pretty bad ones in there. Where there are criticals, there are fumbles. Fumbles on a casting test means that you lose control of the magic you're weaving, and very much at the wrong moment. The spell fails and you have to roll on the miscast table, which can be found on page 235. Another danger for magic users is attempting to cast near sources of corruption. These malignant influences stir up the winds and make them much more difficult to control. So if you roll an 8 on the ones die while attempting to use magic near such a source, you receive a minor miscast, even if it was a success. This escalates to a major miscast if the roll would naturally result in a minor one. Some RPG systems allow wizards to cancel their spells at any time. The old world's Winds of Magic aren't so easily bossed around though, and if a spell is successfully cast, it remains in effect unless it is successfully dispelled by the caster or someone else. As I mentioned earlier, some spellcasters may wish to cast spells directly from their grimoire. This could be a last-ditch effort because the character didn't want to invest the time or XP for a seldom-used spell. Either way, to cast like this, the spell must be from a lord that they've trained, and doing so doubles the casting number. GMs should also consider how convenient it is to pull said grimoire out. So if the swords are flying and there's fire and there's whatever, Michael Bay sort of stuff going on, you're not going to read a book out loud. And if you do, maybe it gets destroyed.
Magic missile!
Magic missile!
Magic missile!
Magic missile!
Some spells create ranged missile-like effects. When targeting an enemy with one of these, the language magic roll is used to determine the hit location. Just like with any other ranged attack, you reverse the test roll and use that against the table to determine the hit location. Damage is calculated by adding the spell's damage, listed in the core rules, with the success level from the language magic test and the caster's wisdom bonus. So those three things are the total damage. Unless otherwise stated, reducing for toughness and armor is also done here too. So touch spells mean you actually have to touch the target. Boop. And unless that target's willing, the spellcasters actually have to make a melee brawling test, boop, opposed by the target's melee or dodge skill. This roll is made after the language magic test, and it's also used to determine the hit location for the touch. Casters sometimes use ingredients as a conduit through which to channel magic for their spells. These serve as a bit of a buffer, reducing the effects of a miscast if it should happen. When using an ingredient, any major miscast is actually downgraded to a minor one, and minor ones are actually ignored completely. Ingredients are consumed with each casting, and the GM should try to be as descriptive as possible when painting the picture of the energy's reaction with the ingredient. Does the proverbial newt's eye smolder and pop in the caster's hand as the spell effect manifests? Does the lump of coal vanish in a puff of white ash? Use your imagination and make sure to paint a picture that brings this to life. Your players will thank you for it. Now, there are a few sensible limitations to keep things real and balanced during play where magic is involved. First, you have to be able to speak clearly and often loudly to cast. An inhibition to your speaking ability will either impart a serious penalty to your language magic check or negate your ability to cast entirely. For any targeted spells, sight and line of sight on your target is likely a requirement as well. Only a single instance of a character spell may be in effect at a given time. So if you have a spell in effect, you must dispel it or wait for it to expire on its own before casting that spell again. Spells that provide bonuses or penalties do not stack. Where multiple of these is cast on a single target, the best bonus or worst penalty is used. So in other words, a wizard buffing a target's wisdom with a +10 bonus can't cast a different spell that buffs for another 20 to get +30. Instead, you just take the highest bonus. So you'd use the +20 and discard the +10. Let's talk about channeling. Though the Winds of Magic can produce some incredible results, the level of energy free-flowing through the old world isn't always enough for some spells. For this, we have channeling. Channeling means that your character is using his or her ability to focus and gather energy, kind of like a mortal battery, to power a major spell. To do this, the character must make an extended test using the channeling skill. Remember that extended tests allow you to make multiple rolls and accumulate success level for an action over the course of a number of rounds. So to channel energy for the big whammy, determine the casting number for the spell and start testing your channeling skill. So when you've gathered enough success levels to equal the casting number, then you're fully charged and ready to cast. On the next round, you may then make a language magic check, but against a casting number of 0. So as long as it's not a complete failure, you succeed. Concentration is important in any spell casting, and incredibly so when channeling over time for more powerful spells. So when channeling, the caster must remain still and focused, preferably in a place free of distractions. If distracted by flashing lights or loud noises or being stabbed in the chest repeatedly with a spear, the character must pass a hard cool test or lose all energy and suffer a minor miscast. Plus, I mean, there's the spear thing, if you were being stabbed by the spear. As a house rule, I state that characters channeling energy without protection in the form of cover or companions are treated as prone in terms of the bonuses their enemies get to hit them. If you're going to wield this kind of power, you should probably think about the risks and not just do it out in the open and wait for bad things to happen. I mean, I'm not being mean. It's just, I like that rule. For reasons only partially to do with personal style, users of magic tend to be a bit fashion conscious. First, each wind of magic has an associated color that is literally drawn to. So practitioners of a given lore typically wear garb of this color to assist them in harnessing the wind's powers. Failing to wear the wind's color actually carries a 1 success level penalty to any casting or channeling attempt. That's 1 whole success level. So stock up on those purple outfits, Amethyst Order, you're gonna need them. In most cases, armor is a big no-no for casters. In fact, casting or channeling while wearing armor also results in a -1 success level penalty per armor point in your most armored body location. So if you're wearing a chest plate, then you use that. If you're just wearing greaves and nothing else, you use those. Casters with the Arcane Magic Metal talent may wear metal armor, and those with the Arcane Magic Beasts talent can wear leather. It's just something they're allowed to do. They can't shoot fire, and they can't shoot lightning. So now we know how to cast spells, but how does one dispel them? Well, that's handled in 2 ways. First, a wizard can attempt to counter the casting of a spell by another by chanting the appropriate counterspell. To do this, he or she must be close enough to the caster and win an opposed language magic test. Success means that the spell is defeated, fizzles out. In the case of failure, the success of the casting is determined as usual. It's pretty much as if nothing happened. You just chanted at the guy and then he blasts you in the face with a fireball. This kind of dispel may only be attempted once per round. For persistent spells, or spells that were successfully cast and remain in effect, a wizard must make an extended language magic test, targeting the casting number of the persistent spell. So if I put up some kind of wall of force, I can dispel that if I can counterspell at that success level. If 2 casters from the same lore are attempting to dispel, you can actually handle that as an assisted test. We covered that way back in our first video. I hadn't slept in a couple days. Okay, it was a pretty bad video. Got us started, you know? So, Warpstone is a physical manifestation of pure magic in the material plane. Although its form does vary, it tends to be stony or crystalline in appearance and gives off a putrid green glow. Close examination is extremely dangerous. Direct contact with it can bring illness, madness, and mutation. Further, ingesting even the slightest amount of Warpstone will permanently warp the body and the mind. Still, despite the dangers, there are those who use it for its raw magical power. Skaven filth don't hesitate to use it, nor do the corrupt powers of chaos. To those willing to take on the grave risk, the stone is more valuable than any gem or precious metal. It's just that powerful. A wizard using Warpstone to assist them in casting or channeling doubles his or her success level for all tests related to casting or channeling. Doing this is actually treated as a corrupting influence, though, and could bring about some serious consequences as detailed in the section about corruption. Or you could go back and watch our video about corruption. I think we even used the green background. It's good cut. That's about it for our fly-through of the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition Magic system. Make sure to pick up your copy of the core rulebook for all the details on spells, for each lore, and all the other things that we really couldn't cover here. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up and tell us what we got right in the comments below. We read and consider every comment and suggestion, and without feedback, kind of flying blind. Please do subscribe to the channel. We're gaining ground against the notorious algorithm every day, and your support and involvement has been a key part of that. We will see you next time, but in the meantime, remember, don't cross the winds. Crossing the winds is bad unless you're an elf. Then